can help me as well. Maybe spend a little bit more time exploring anything that you knew you wanted some clarity on, or that you had questions about. All right, let me see if I can. There we go. Okay. Well, I'm sure that I will raise some for you. We'll see. All right. So last week we talked about this idea that there was a philosophical problem of evil. And we said that this philosophical problem is this idea that how can God and the world both exist? If the world exists like this and it exists with all this evil, it just doesn't make any sense for there to be a God. We talked about some of the different ways that was talked about. In particular, we said that some, whereas philosophers and atheists used to say, it's impossible for there to be a God and evil, a lot are not arguing that anymore. Instead, they're arguing that it's very unlikely that there could be a God given the amount or the types of evil in the world. We talked also about how there's different types of evil. We talked about moral evil and natural evil. Moral evil is this evil that is done by agents. So somebody does it. If I steal or if I kill, that's moral evil. It's done by an agent, by somebody. Whereas natural evil is the suffering that comes about from where we cannot identify any individual agent. When you think of natural disasters, things like this, illnesses, disease, these are forms of natural evil. And when we talk about the problem of evil, we're trying to identify how it is that God could be who Scripture tells us who God is, and the world could be the way it is. That is, the world could be marred with sin and evil. So I also talked about how there's not only what we call the logical problem of evil, an evidential problem of evil, but there's a pastoral problem of evil. And a lot of times in our ministry context, this is the problem of evil that we will oftentimes find ourselves dealing with. This is the problem in which somebody is trying to reconcile their own faith, their own belief in God, with the things that they've experienced. And for many Christians, this becomes, at some point, a point of tension. For many Christians, they will ask, how is it that I can believe in this God and such can happen to me? And so I hope that in talking about some of the ways that the church has responded to the problem of evil, I'll also give you some tools that you can use in ministry in talking with folks about this. Now, the other thing I didn't talk about last week, but that I think I just touched on it, was that when it comes to the problem of evil, what you're coming to is you're coming to a crossroads in a lot of theological beliefs. So who you think God is, who you think people are, what you think evil is, all of this is going to inform how you would respond to somebody who comes to you asking about the problem of evil. One of the perhaps easiest ways to illustrate this has to do with sovereignty. Now, Christians disagree on sovereignty. They disagree on how much control does God have over things that happen in the world. How much control does God have? A lot of times, we as Christians would say, God is fully in control. But if you were to take somebody's belief and you were to kind of pin it down a little bit and push it down, you would say, well, to what extent is God in control over free actions? Is God in control over free actions? You could say yes, and you would say, well, in what respect? Does God dictate our free choices? Or is God responding to free choices? Now, you can see how, or let's connect this to the problem of evil. If I'm dealing with a murder of, let's say, an innocent child, horrific, right? The murder of an innocent child. If I believe that the free choice of whoever had done that murder was also determined in a sort of deterministic way by God, the problem of evil that I'm dealing with is different than if I believe that free choices are part of the makeup of this world, and that although God is sovereignly working through all things for our good, God does not actually control every free choice. Does that connection between how we understand God's control and the problem of evil, is that, can I clarify that at all for you all? Or are you seeing the connections between these different beliefs and the problem of evil that we deal with? Yes, Bernetta.
I I am and I'm not, because I have to go by how I've been taught all these years, about free will.
Mhm,
And so to me, evil is a choice.
mhm,
Just like, not like being, I'll just say being good is a choice.
right.
So who makes us do what we do? Is it us, or is it, I mean, I'm thinking it has to be us. But I'm gonna tell you what I've always had kind of just a little problem with is children, and good and evil. The like, I've been told that there's an age of accountability. So before that age, and I mean, would you say that children are sinning? I mean, I don't know. I've never been, that I can't, that I don't understand. I haven't really been able to grasp that. So we have good and evil in the world, and God gives us free will. But when it comes to children, what is the
Yeah.
problem? Or what is the situation?
Yes. Yeah. And so when it comes to, oh, yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was trying to
Oh,
turn my mic
oh
off
no,
and I
you're
hit.
good. You're good. I just want to make sure if you had more to say, no, because um, you are raising the important issues, or at least some of the most important issues when it comes to this. Now, I want to start with what you started with, which is or we could we could just say free choices by agents, like by humans who you would say are able to make free choices. Okay. Now, why I said that your understanding of God's sovereignty, how you understand God's control, is going to have an effect of how you understand the problem of evil. And so by you saying yes, you've always been taught that free will is very important, and that we as human beings um, have this ability to choose right and to choose wrong. You know, now many in the Christian tradition hold that view, but there are different understandings of free will within the Christian tradition. And so that's why I say that how you understand free will is going to affect how you can explain it. Now, if you understand what you just said, then you can usually use one of the best arguments is just the free will defense, which is just like you said, human beings have free will. And so the evil that is done in the world is done because we choose it. Now, there are other if you have a stronger understanding of God's sovereignty, then you're going to have to come up with an alternative response to the problem of evil. Now, I'll maybe flesh that out in a moment, but I think that because of your question, I want to just say that for now, and then get to the question of children. Now, frankly, I'm not sure on this. Now, my own tradition, which is the Baptist tradition, has dealt with children in a couple of ways. One of them is the age of accountability. Now, this is to say that at some point, a child is sinning in an intentional way. And prior to that, their sin is not one of conscious action. But of course, when we talk about sin, I think that we always want to say sin is not only things that we do, sin is a power. And it is a power that informs everything that we are. We are born under sin, and that means both that we are born under the power of sin, but we are also born under the guilt of sin. And a lot of times this question of the age of accountability comes up with respect to both the power of sin, but also with the guilt of sin. Now, in the history of the church, infant baptism was one of the earliest solutions to this problem of guilt. Okay, so if you think in terms of sin bringing guilt, which brings ultimate death, eternal death, infant baptism was understood as the washing away of that original sin. And so in a similar way to how, now here's how, theological views do things, okay? What do I mean by this? I mean, my theological beliefs, when I have them, they're almost like this toolbox. And so if I am not handy at home, okay, so I am going to be awful at these illustrations, but let's say I have a hammer and I have a screwdriver and I need to hammer in a nail at my house. I'm going to grab the hammer and I'm going to take that hammer, I'm going to hit it. Now, a lot of times theological views work like this. We have, for example, the theological view of infant baptism, okay? Some people would hold this. That theological view is going to do things. So if I have this problem of guilt, I'm going to say, what do I do with this guilt that infants have? Because if an infant dies and they're 1 year old, what are we going to do with that? Do they go to hell because they're under the guilt of sin? Or is there another way we can deal with that theological problem? And so for a long time, what the church did was it took out the hammer of infant baptism and it said, I'm going to hammer in this and it's going to deal with this. No, the guilt is washed clean as long as that child is baptized. But then you have other theologians come along and they say, you know what? I don't believe in infant baptism. I think baptism is for believers. But you still have this problem, right? You have this problem of what do you say to people who lose a child? What do you do? And so one of the ways that we don't have a hammer anymore, but we have the screwdriver, which is we pull it out and it's like, this is our idea of accountability, age of accountability. And so age of accountability is a way of saying, how do we understand what happens to infants who die apart from faith, right? The problem, of course, is that with some of these theological views, there's not a whole lot of scripture to kind of ground them on. And the age of accountability is one of those. I think it makes logical sense, but it's doing a lot of theological work that isn't necessarily grounded in anything scripturally. I don't think that makes it bad necessarily, but I think it's something to be aware of, okay? So I think that sometimes when it comes to these issues, sometimes we have to think about what doctrine we're going to appeal to. What tool are we going to use? And I think our best tool when it comes to infants and children is the grace and love of God, okay? And so I don't know if we need to draw on, I'll say this. We don't need a doctrine of baptismal regeneration, okay? We don't need that doctrine, actually. We don't necessarily need an age of accountability, but it could help us. I think it helps get us there. But I think that the tool that we want to pull out is the grace and the love and the mercy of God. And we want to say that when it comes to children, we leave those children to God's hands, the God who is revealed in Jesus Christ, who welcomes children. And so I think that all that was to say is it's important what theological views we use to deal with these questions. And so when it comes to the problem of evil, though, usually the questions aren't directed towards, like, let's say, evil acts that children do, but more so evil acts that are done to children. So any clarifying questions on that?
Your first statement in argumentation or response to sorry. Maybe you'll get to it, or maybe the understanding of his separating or compartmentalizing the understanding into like his sovereign will, and then
I won't get into that.
No.
Not in this class, no. And that's because I can't. I unfortunately I get you 3 hours once a week and not 3 hours every day. But no. But that is so. One of the ways. This is a good point, Andrew. One of the ways that people have talked about the sovereignty of God is they've distinguished the what you could call the decreed will of God, which is what God tells us in written down, and then the God's invisible, or there's another term, and it's but God's essentially God's will in which He has ordained all that will come to pass. And so, if you're interested in that, I will spend more time. I'll probably just give you resources, because that's getting into some of the nitty gritty of the differences between different theological traditions. So, but no, it's a great question. Okay, and so. We talked about, again, different problems. Now, let's talk about the responses, okay? How have Christians responded to these different problems of evil? Now, the way that I will teach this material is I will not be telling you this is the best way to respond. What I will do is I will show you, I want to talk about some of the options. And these are different tools, and some of them will work for your theological viewpoints, but some won't for others. And that's why, because we're coming from, some of us are coming from different theological traditions. I want us to be able to kind of see the broad scope of what Christians have thought. And honestly, I also want us to see some of the ways in which these come together, or the ways in which Christians can actually agree on a lot of things when it comes to responding to the problem of evil. Now, again, we have another kind of technical distinction when it comes to our response as Christians. There is what's called a theodicy, and then there's what's called a defense, okay? A theodicy and a defense. Now, the theodicy is stronger, okay? It's stronger. A theodicy tries to identify why God permits evil. Why? So when you were standing up front after the closing benediction on Sunday morning, and somebody comes up to you and they will say, "Minister, Reverend, I need to pray with you. My daughter decided she's moving out of the house. She decided she's not coming back, and she's gone back to this horrible path that she's walked on before. Why, Reverend? Why did you do that?" Theodicy tries to identify why. It tries to give you a reason that you can say, ma'am, Scripture is clear that all evil happens because of such and such. Now, you'll notice that I said that in such a way that it's probably an exaggeration, right? It's an exaggeration to say that Scripture says all evil happens because of such and such. But I'm doing that just to say this is the strength of it. This is the strength of the argument. These philosophers, these theologians want to be able to say this is the reason why God allows evil, okay? A defense is different. A defense, and I think this is where most of us will end up landing. This is what we'll want to do. We'll want to offer a defense to people. And a defense is simply to say, there are rational reasons for why God might have permitted evil. You know? And so when you're dealing with people, you might not be able to say without a shadow of a doubt, all evil happens because of this. But you know what? I see in scripture and I see in our world that God is working through evil. I see that good has come from evil. Not in every instance, but it seems as though there may be rational reasons for why God permits this evil. Or there are, usually you would say, there are rational reasons for why God permits evil. Now, if the distinction there is not helpful for you, it's okay. This is going to be one of those when it comes to the difference between a theodicy and a defense. This is Theo 101. You'll come back to it at some point, Lord willing. But for right now, just hold it up here. Okay. Now let's talk about some theodicies. Okay. We'll talk about soul making. We'll talk about the unreality of evil, and we'll talk about higher order goods, okay? So just fancy terms for things that we actually appeal to all of these at some point. We usually, well, I shouldn't say all of them, but a lot of times we will use these in everyday language when we're talking about our faith. So the soul-making theodicy is this idea that evil exists for our growth. Evil exists for our growth. And this is the idea that our faith is strengthened through suffering. Sounds biblical, doesn't it? In many respects. Of course, the caveat to that is that suffering apart from faith will not lead to, right? And so it does not.
No.
It could. It certainly could at some point, you know, and that's the thing is there could be a delay between our suffering and the growth of our faith and our sanctification, right? I mean, I can count me in for amen on a little bit of a delay sometimes between me going through something and my faith being strengthened by it, but this is an idea, and this is actually a scriptural idea. That is, that our faith gets strengthened through the suffering that we can experience. Of course, this would not deal with all evil, would it? There would be some exceptions to what this can deal with. Exceptions, again, where there's suffering that does not, at least from what we can see, lead to growth in faith. And John Hick, so there's two real famous proponents of this, Irenaeus and John Hick. Hick says, a world without problems, difficulties, perils, and hardships would be morally static. For moral and spiritual growth comes through response to challenges. And in paradise, there will be no challenges. And so this is a way that we've understood, that the Christian tradition has understood the suffering that Christians undergo. And this is from the very beginning when you think about the martyrs of the faith. Okay. A second theodicy, the unreality of evil. Now, I mentioned this briefly last week. The unreality of evil is this idea that evil is as darkness as good is to light. So if you think of light and darkness, and you think of darkness and you say, does darkness exist? Yes, but also no. Darkness is the lack of light. And so evil is a lack of good. Why would somebody say this? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One of the major reasons is that it allows for theologians to explain how it is that God created all things but did not create evil. Let me explain that. Because one of the things that comes up is people will say, well, who created, for example, Satan? How did Satan get in the world? How do we have the sin that led Adam and Eve to sin? Where did that come from? And one of the ways that the Christian tradition has dealt with that is they said, God created what is good. God created not the evil or the sin that was in Adam and Eve, or however you want to conceive of when sin entered, but God created the potential for it, potential for evil. And evil is simply when we choose not the good, when we do not choose the good. Now, I think that there are some really helpful ways of using this in our own, of incorporating this into how we conceive of God and the world. But I also think that this is it can be seen as kind of an overcomplicated way of talking about things. So let's go on. But of course, ask me questions if you want. Finally, yes.
Okay, I'm back again because you just said something that I just wrote down when you said about Adam and Eve, because I was thinking and I wrote down what good and evil has always been from creation,
Yeah.
from the time of creation. So it's not, well, we know it's not new because
It's not.
it was evil that
Mhm.
tempted Eve. So
Well,
but wasn't it? But it was Eve's choice, though.
That is right. The problem that gets raised though is people will say, well, who created the tempter? And so you can either say, and I'm going to be honest, okay, so there are people in the Christian tradition that will just say God created evil. Okay? That is now what I'm saying is I don't want to go that route. Okay? One of the ways that the Christian tradition has been able to say God didn't was to say what God creates is good and evil is a defect of that. When God creates human beings, God creates the possibility that there would be evil. There's the possibility and the potentiality of evil, but it's human actions or the actions of spiritual beings, however you want to discuss the origin of evil, that actually causes that. And so that's where and why I think incorporating this understanding of evil as a defect or as a lack can be helpful. Because a lot of times at some point you're going to press the issue further and further and further, and you're going to say, who made that? Who made that? Who made that? Who made that? It's like a kid's question of who made God? Of course, we don't go that far. But this idea, and so what we want to be able to say is what God made was good. And how do we understand even that possibility of evil being in there? Well, it's the possibility of a lack of good. And the ability for human beings to choose the good brought with it this understanding that they could choose the bad. Yes, Burnett.
I'm going to definitely listen to, because you just said something and you put it in a way that I've never, ever heard it. So I will be listening to this again so I can get that. I've never heard it put that way. And I, whenever you get a chance to read my reflection paper, you see I'm working on this theology thing. So
You're doing well.
But it's making me think more than I have ever thought, about different things. Because even when you're saying that, I think about Romans 8:28, when it says all things work together for the good to them, that love the Lord and call according to His purpose and all that. So all things would include good and evil.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so yeah. Yes, Cheryl.
I hope I'm not taking us backward, but I just want to share something, and maybe you can kind of help me out, and maybe it'll help others. So we had right before Christmas, we had a church member. She lost a baby full term, and it has been really devastating. We have the whole family in our church, so we've got mom and dad and grandma and grandpa and great grandma and great grandpa, and it comes up again in conversation this why?
Mhm.
And so I apparently I haven't answered it to anyone's satisfaction because I'll give an answer, but then it comes up again. And so I was just wondering if maybe the soul making kind of touched me a little bit, because I was thinking, well, maybe there's something there, but I don't know if they're really ready to hear that.
Yeah.
But it's just been a very heartbreaking
Mhm.
thing
Mm,
for all of us.
Yeah. Understandably so. Um, Now, what you that ex- what that actually brings up, though, when you reference the soul making, is you're actually giving one of the greatest critiques against soul making. And this is something I didn't say, so I'm glad that you shared. One of the problems with the soul making, and I'll use this horrific example, is that suffering was not soul making for that child. That child, and this was one of I you know I lost my nephew, um 3 weeks old, drunk driver, runs through a stop sign. And it was one of those moments that led me to think about these things in a way I hadn't. And to just sit and say, how do I approach people who are suffering these horrific things? And I found through that time that a lot of the things that I had said may not have been as helpful. And so where I land now is actually, I believe it's the last thing we'll talk about. And I usually will, depending upon the situation, will draw on different aspects, particularly when we're dealing with less horrific evil, where I can say, God used your wayward journey in a way that has now been a blessing to others, right? Things like that. But there are these other instances of horrific evil where my go-to is not really a rational argument. It is presence, and then it is reminder of Christian hope. And it's unfortunate because that tension that we feel, that turmoil of this side of glory is there, and it's there, unfortunately, it's in some sense to tell us that we are not yet there. We do not yet experience this. And I think that there's something different about saying, we don't know. We might not be able to give a reason why for every instance of horrific evil, but we do know God who will overcome it all. And with that being said, I think that when the free will defense or the free will argument is one of the best ways we have a kind of understanding why any of it is horrific, why there is any evil in the world at all. Yes, Bernetta.
Okay, I promise this is it for me for tonight. But several years ago, my baby daughter, she was 15, and her best friend at the time she was 13, and they were both getting ready to have birthdays in the same month. They were born in February, were killed in a car accident. And I'm thinking about what Shirley's saying. There's some, you have to. There are time frames for different things in grief. In grief, there are written stages of grief, but they don't come in order.
Yeah.
They don't come in, and they don't come in the order, but there are stages of grief. And there's a book that my husband found. It's called I can't even think of the author's name, but it's Getting Past What You'll Never Get Over.
Mm,
And there are a lot of things in life that we'll never get over them. But as believers, we must move on
Mhm.
and get past them. But those things that come back, and that was years ago. And
Mhm.
her birthday was just on the 16th of this month, and so you relive, and it was years ago when the accident happened. So you can relive things
Yeah.
that happened 50 years ago. If you're
Mhm.
old enough to. So, but I think we try to understand more
Mhm.
than we should.
Mhm. And I hope you hear me saying that too. I really do. I do think that there are people who give their lives to these questions, the rational sort of, thinking through them. And I thank God for those people. But also, I think also a bit of a dose of humility. Um, you know, in thinking about Bernetta, what you shared and the grief and the way in which grief it is stages, but you never know on any given day what stage you're going to wake up in. Um, well, and related to this idea of us thinking through the problem of evil, I I I think that the fact that our bodies grieve should tell us how rational thinking will get us so far. And when I say that, I'm sure, I mean, I know I'm probably one of the younger in the room, and so my experiences probably match that. But I know, so I lost my father to brain cancer. It's been a decade. But you couldn't tell my body it's been a decade, you know? And that was one of the things about grieving that I never understood is that you don't choose. You don't think even. There is a grief that happens in your body. And if that doesn't tell us that these ways of thinking are going to get us so far, I don't know what else does. And so thank you for sharing. And I believe that there's something even about talking through this, right, with others that is a bit of a healing process, right?
Definitely.
Um, well, um, let me read this quote from Planaga. It's too wordy, but what he says is great. Okay. He says the theist may find a religious problem in evil. In the presence of his own suffering or that of someone near to him, he may find it difficult to maintain what he takes to be the proper attitude towards God. Faced with great personal suffering or misfortune, he may be tempted to rebel against God, to shake his fist in God's faith, or even to give up belief in God altogether. And such a problem calls not for philosophical enlightenment, but for pastoral care. And I think that this is a fitting end because I can say that this is what I need in times of undergoing suffering. And I know that this is what others need as well. Not for you to bring them philosophical enlightenment, although a little bit here and there might not hurt. But what people need is pastoral care. And a lot of times, if we think this is the meat and potatoes, and then philosophical enlightenment, these sorts of rational, um, they are they are the sprinkled on top. All right, let me pause here, and we will start up with the Jesus Christ lecture. So if you want to pull up those slides, and Yvette, I'm going to send you this link here. If I post it here in the chat, is this good?
Let me see. Thank you.
Yes, no problem. Now, I also wanted, Yvette, you're on the Google Classroom too, right? Because
Yes.
there is a way, so do you use your phone or an iPad? How do you, or the
Yeah. Well,
computer?
I have my iPad right now, but I need to switch on to a different device.
Yeah.
So,
So the one thing you can do is you can actually, there is a link on both like if you go on the Google Classroom, if you see a little camera icon, you can click on that and that links right to it.
okay.
So, yeah. All right. I'm just gonna pause.